Mini episode 1254 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1254. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris here with our FDH NBA analyst Ben Chu. We are going to be breaking down players in the NBA bubble, looking at the start of the convening in Orlando for the resumption of the regular season / playoffs. This is part 24 of our Coronavirus Crisis 2020 series, but this is going to be a little more lighthearted than some of our looks at what's going on, and there's not a lot that's lighthearted in today's coronavirus news, but the players that are down there in the bubble, some of the early things that have happened as they have reported, some of the early mishaps all the way around. Ben, the only thing I can think to say is NBA bubble follies, it's fantastic.
Well, again, Rick, I got brought back because, again, I do another show, more residuals in the future, so I guess that's not the worst thing in the world.
That's right. They keep accruing as we're going along here, and all kinds of things happening. You know, one of the things we might as well get to, one of the most colorful things, we just talked about it off air, the fact that a memo had to go out for NBA players to be wearing pants or something like that or whatever, be wearing something when room service comes there. As you pointed out to me off air, Ben, that doesn't happen from one isolated incident. This had to be more than once, probably a lot more than once.
Right. I mean, especially within the memo itself, it's an inappropriate attire when picking it up. So are we, to close the old the Stephon Marbury, maybe you see in the magazine commercials, like, are we saying full nude, or are we just saying there should be nude, or they like wearing a robe, or I don't know. That's the question. And now the bigger question is if they have people, not in terms of, I guess, someone was reprimanded, it's more in terms of how many people were reprimanded and who was the most famous person who probably was reprimanded.
Well, exactly. And this is one of these things where, and when they're talking about inappropriate attire, Ben, it's not like anybody raided any of my drawers and got any of my old Big Johnson t-shirts. I think we're looking at something worse than that.
Yes. Something very worse. And I mean, I'm just going to make the rough assumption that it's probably not unusual. But we also live in a super weird timeline, so at some point it happened enough to where either someone complained about it or someone decided to use the snitch line, snitch off of the fellow players to get out of their issue, or out of the rage, I guess.
Well, exactly. And if any of this was in any way, and we're just speculating here, but I don't think it's a big speculation. If it's anything along the lines of sexual harassment, shall we say, of anybody that's been bringing food to the rooms here, you throw that in there. You throw in the story early on about this Instagram model going on Twitter and talking about that she'd already gotten an invite inside the bubble. So the single element of this that we knew was the biggest potential threat to the entire thing going forward, i.e. that signature part of the male anatomy, that remains the leader in the clubhouse as far as the favorite to blow this thing up.
I mean, I think it was supposed to be assumed, but also another level to it, though, I would think at some point it was just going to be the amount of days that you have to stay in just in the bubble. I remember I read an article this week where they said that the lowest average stay for a player in the bubble will be 14 days, and for any team that makes the finals, it's up to 3 months. Now, to you and me, Rick, we see that as a long time. We've done work somewhere where we've had to be in certain areas, but we tend to forget
Yeah, and I think the only real surprise is that it didn't take any period of time at all for some of these things to happen. I think we've assumed, a lot of us, it might take a little bit of time before some of these irregularities started popping up, but it is an interesting dichotomy in terms of those of us outside the bubble. A lot of us, unfortunately, at this timetable in mid-July are back into some form of quasi-quarantine, no matter where we are in this country. So, yes, there is more freedom of movement. We can get in our car, we can go places outside of that, but by the same token, a lot of us are at home a good chunk at a time versus, as you pointed out, what's on the grounds there? Yes, they cannot veer beyond the grounds, but what's on the grounds is extremely expansive when you're talking about the quality of food available, when you're talking about a lot of these guys that love to fish have been out there fishing in the ponds there. I mean, this is like the best place you can be if you got to do something like this.
Right. I mean, one thing we have to know too is that the NBA has been incredibly accommodating with what they were able to do. Now, obviously, we've seen complaints about the rooms in the initial timeline. I know Rondo of the Lakers was public about his displeasure for his room. But it's going to be the issue that a lot of players are dealing with, because we've seen, in the NBA, and especially being based in Portland, I've seen sort of NBA players have stayed at. So they are very extravagant, but at the same time, most of them are relatively normal still. So I understand the question, especially why any player is not happy with their setup. But we also have to understand, too, that they are essentially being shipped out to that area to play the game and to get paid on some level.
They are.
I think the common fan loses a little bit of sympathy, because most of us actually have to, if you are currently not working from home, you have to physically go out and put your life on risk when certain places, you would say the NBA, there's always a risk of catching coronavirus no matter whatever safety precautions you take into effect. It's just very interesting to see how everything play out. And I remember I saw early on there was a tweet from former Notre Dame star Jeff Cooley, who's currently playing overseas in Japan, about kind of semi-mocking a lot of these NBA players who are complaining about their rooms not being of 5-star quality, when we've all seen, if you play international basketball, your hotel rooms are usually not that great. Or they're like maybe even essential of Disney World at this point. So.
Yeah, and the thing of it is, too, at a time when so many people are down on their luck because of the unfortunate circumstances of the world right now, like you said, the complaining about the rooms, early on the complaining about they had to have the pre-prepared food for the folks that were going to be in quarantine, and you got players comparing this to the Fire Festival. I mean, you are not at all in touch with reality if you are complaining about what you got going on down there relative to what the pain that so many people are going through right now.
Right. And I mean, one of the points I made is that's obviously the joke, but on the other side, one defining factor is that Fire Festival attendees actually paid for food in that timeline.
Right.
So,
yeah. Exactly. And that makes it all the more inappropriate to complain about it. And again, you look at the circumstances of it, and everything that's being done. I know there's a lot of pain in the ass stuff, but everything that's being done, all the protocols are try to keep players safe. The one thing where I'm going to be sympathetic to any of them are anybody that's got loved ones there. I know I've seen some stuff here about players trying to communicate with their kids by video and everything like that. That I legitimately feel sorry for. Anybody that had to leave home, to separate, to go in the bubble, the loneliness from your family, I have all the sympathy in the world on a human level for that. For any of the quote-unquote inconveniences that you've got while you're there, and again, you're seeing some of them, on the other hand, that are taking up the time, and as I said all along, putting the time to good use. I see that there are some players that are starting video blogs and doing things like that, and trying to expand themselves and their own brands. I mean, this is one of the greatest opportunities in the world for them if you want to take it for that.
Right, and I mean, the two biggest examples of that would be the Philadelphia 76ers rookie Matthias Thybulle, who started his own YouTube series.
Yes.
I know Miami Heat center Myers Leonard has been very popular on social media right now. Just with all his stuff, JJ Redick, who we know that worked with the Ringer in the past, has been very on brand and just trying to get all his stuff out there. If you're an NBA player, this is the perfect time to market yourself, because we all still see it the perfect time for Indianapolis to market brand, get your team out there. And the thing too is that we've used this rule because we remember the initial 2 months of how we felt during lockdown. But you have a lot of time on your hands, so you have to either focus on passion projects or things you need to work on in terms of just your brand or what do I have to do in terms of writing or any sort of video or photo or just any social media. You have the time to do these things now in comparison to a timeline prior to coronavirus where everyone would make the excuse, oh, I don't have the time to do that. I have to be out and about. We're in a weird timeline zone of coronavirus, and it feels that a lot of players are taking advantage of it, and I think even more players take advantage of it as the season continues.
Absolutely. I have immense respect for anybody working the hustle right now. I'm glad you mentioned Tybal. He's probably the best example of what I was thinking of with that. And again, somebody who's already known, even as a rookie, as one of the best young defensive players in the league, getting to be known for more than that. Good for him. He sees the opportunity. He's taking it. And that's the kind of spirit that, you'll like to see out of any of them that are there. And again, it is a completely different, completely surreal kind of atmosphere. Again, just go back 6 months to what we would be thinking if we were told that these were the circumstances and the NBA was having to resume its season at the end of July. I mean, everything that is being done is of such an unprecedented nature. But again, there's a lot of weirdness that goes with it, with going there and experiencing this. But with some of the early violations about players going, over whatever invisible line there is. Obviously, there's no snipers guarding that line to go get their food and ending up back in quarantine again for their takeout. All this talk now, well, it's not just talk, I guess it's reality. There is a snitch line. There's been a lot of, I see a lot of joking speculation. I think it's joking on Twitter about Chris Paul being the chief guy manning the snitch line, phoning in stuff on other people. It's an extraordinarily weird timeline when you get into the enforcement side of this, Ben.
Right, and I think moving forward is going to be interesting and intriguing because I think the NBA is going to do their best to crack down. But we all know, too, occasionally someone will reach the bubble at some point. I think that's just going to happen, or someone later who has their family members come in during the playoffs, maybe someone who isn't technically a family member gets their way into the bubble on some level. But I mean, just in the totality, we were always going to see people leave the bubble. But I mean, to know so far, if we're being honest, only officially, if we're going in terms of people who have just left the bubble not without approval from the league, it's only 2 players. Bruno Caboclo of I believe of the Rockets. He's been around a lot, Rick. So I'm trying to remember. There's been a team he played for. So,
right.
And then obviously the most profile case, Sacramento case forward center, Rashawn Holmes, who apparently left and crossed the line to get some form of delivery food. We don't know what it was, and still may never know what it was. But it's a weird timeline. I also think, though, that I think players are going to be allowed to move freely outside of what we already saw with Darnell Woods and the Pelicans go back to deal with a family matter. I thought that Schroeder is going to leave at some point for the Oklahoma City Thunder to attend the birth of his, to I believe attend the birth of one of his kids. Same thing with Gordon Hayward and family at some point. So it's going to be very interesting how the NBA is going to treat players traveling in and out of the bubble, because we know it's going to happen. And the league protocol at this point is that they're supposed to test negative every day outside of the bubble. But also at the same time, when they come back, they still have to quarantine for up to 4 days. And we're going to see an interesting scenario. Like we'll use the guy on the profile example right now, is that he will probably be back with the restart with the seeding games. But we do not know for sure if he does hypothetically catch coronavirus at some period of time. That could delay his return to the bubble, or it could delay him from playing it after going through quarantine. So there's it's uncharted territory for the league, but they have the infrastructure we saw at Vegas Summer League to kind of fall back on, because they at least understand how to deal with multiple players and multiple teams in the same area, which I don't think tends to happen in these other pro sports.
Right. Yeah.
I'm going to maybe spring training in baseball was probably the nearest comparison.
Yeah, you got a lot of variables officials involved here, and again, and certainly hoping that nobody gets this / brings it in. It's going to be a fascinating social experiment along those lines to see how it goes. And as far as, again, I was joking about this before, about the bubble follies and everything like that, but as you and I have been talking off air about this, and we talked on air about the bubble recently here, just when we were taking a look ahead before it had started, but more so than a lot of people, I have been sounding a lot more dour about human nature since the start of this crisis, and the idiocies and the stupidities and everything like that, and the sense that we wouldn't be where we are if people were just smarter, or even more so like potentially like our grandparents' generation. It's hard to see the World War II generation having a lot of the same selfishness that people seem to have today. And then there's a lot of people, on the other hand, like you, who have pointed out, well, Rick, it's just human nature in the year 2020. So there's two ways of looking at this, but either way, you look at the bubble and the problems of the bubble, and when you look at not all athletes that are there have been coddled their entire lives. I get that, but a lot of them, quite frankly, have been. It's hard to believe that that would be a better, more disciplined subset than the rest of humanity. I'm not going to posit that it's necessarily worse, but to expect them to do any better than the rest of us is probably unrealistic.
Right, and I think the issue too is that just if we're talking the generalities of coronavirus, we know a lot about the virus much more than we did when it first hit it. We know much more than we did in February and March. But the issue we're also seeing now is the re-rising of cases in areas where it was moving flat, just in America and in other countries as well. So I tend to think also is that you can lay blame on individuals and people at the end of the day, but we also have to understand that a virus is a virus. You really can't. You can't negate it and then have it work back, because there's just so many narratives where we see the virus get killed off and then it comes back. There are always going to be positive cases and negative cases, but what we've seen, at least in the middle, is that a lot of countries, and a percentage of states in America, have been able to tamper it down from a bit, but then just for it to flare up again. And I think the issue with that moving forward is we're probably going to be on that yo-yo until either a vaccine or drug cocktail is put together, or until, like I predicted, early to mid of 2021, where people will just lose the fear of the virus entirely, because we have now been somewhat trained to understand the current risks we have to deal with it at this point.
Well, I saw a thing the other day, and I find this very, very hard to believe, but Scott Gottlieb, the former head of the FDA, positing that there could be some form of herd immunity by early 2021, because he thinks half the population will have it by then. It's hard to see it going to 150 million in this country by January, but if it's exponential growth, then really anything is possible. But it's amazing how much has changed since even the pre-bubble period. For example, Florida wasn't necessarily that bad, especially in the early going, right, when they were talking about bringing it to Florida and Orlando.
If I remember correctly, they were ranked in the they were in total cases, I think they were in the mid-20s at that point.
Right. Yeah,
so it wasn't perceived as a hot spot initially, and now it has become one.
Sure.
And the interesting part is how everyone's going to deal with it is, at some point, if the case count there becomes unsafe, not that the league would suspend play or anything like that, it's just more in terms of how the bubble might tighten over time if cases outside the border get much worse.
Right, and under the theory that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, I've been saying all along, the fact that you have the employees going to their homes every night in a community that is now riddled with it. Orlando is a hot spot. I mean, not as bad as Miami, but Miami's one of the worst places in the world for it right now. So that's not saying much. But it's a thing where I'm almost wondering, because of everything that has changed, let's say in the last 6 weeks or so, from when the setup was basically put in place to now that it's starting to be implemented, I almost wonder for the players that are there. Because, right, the players, I think a lot of them, it's occurring to them at this point that even if you get it, this could be very bad long term, even if you survive it, because nobody knows, what it might do to your lungs or anything else like that. And that's a worry that I've had for athletes from the beginning. I hope that nobody's career is compromised because of this, although it seems inevitable there will be ones that are. I almost wonder, weirdly enough, if there are ones that are now thinking, because again, the timeline seems to be early 2021, whether it be herd immunity, whether it be a vaccine, whether it be drugs that would arrest this in the early stages before it would keep from getting as destructive, everybody is pointing towards more or less the beginning of next year. So when you look at the timeline, this NBA season, if it plays all the way out, is going to take us right about halfway there, maybe a little bit more than that point. I wonder if the players aren't looking at this and going, you know what? It's good that I'm here because I'm less likely to get it here than in the outside world. They might have thought 6 weeks ago, I could stay in my community, I could stay home. But this is really a case now where even as bad as Orlando is, if the bubble holds up, there truly is no better place to be to preserve your career, to preserve your career prospects, than in a place where everybody's being tested constantly.
Right, and I mean, I go to 2 points with this. The first point is that the perception by even normal everyday humans that you have complete immunity in your own home or in your area is just simply not the case.
Right.
We've seen many scenarios in the news in recent days and weeks where you see stories of people who catch it who say they were very safe and still end up catching it anyway. And another quick thing just off the top of my head is that as we move forward, again, we also have to take into account 2 things with athletes. One, athletes are not normal humans. But currently, the fatality rate for a lot of these cases of coronavirus tend to be within people who are generationally older or who have immune issues or pre-existing conditions. And under most circumstances, I would say roughly 85% of the NBA right now are relatively healthy young people who don't really have any pre-existing conditions. So we're going to assume that everyone is going to be relatively okay. But I also understand if I'm a player, I'm concerned about catching it in the bubble and dealing with the things. But the question is, if we say, and I'll say this to her just to play devil's advocate, is that within our timeline on Earth, we've had many viruses come to the table.
Yep.
And it's very similar to the comic book. I know the comic book doesn't kill, but we also tend to forget that it does kill a lot of people yearly.
Yes.
And we have to consider that on some level that the coronavirus is just an upgraded flu. And at the end of the day, you have to understand that while you have the opportunity to catch a coronavirus, it's probably higher than any other thing. But the issue I always make to people is that you can stay as safe as humanly possible. But again, that's a human psyche thing. And at the end of the day, until we know more about the future, we can't really say what we truly know about the virus. And I think in the media, we have the tendency to think that since we know more currently, we are smarter. That doesn't necessarily mean to be the case. It's very simple, and Mike says it too, is that it's there where different because the virus could get a little bit, calmer. But I've seen multiple reports in terms of different strains across the United States. Some are more virulent than others. And it's also very possible, not necessarily herd immunity comes into play, but people just most people who are currently being affected right now, at least from what we see rising statewide across the state, tend to be younger people who usually tend to survive this without any long-lasting effects, at least from what we know for now. It's weird only because we've seen it hits differently. Like some people are asymptomatic, never have to deal with any problems, and then there are people who catch it who are still dealing with issues to this day.
Yeah, that's true. And again, as you said, there's so much that we don't know. And that's where, again, I try to be humble about what I know or think I know as we go along here. And I find myself frequently pointing out to people a lot, well, how do you know? How do you know? And I'm saying that mostly, I would say, to what I would call the branch COVIDians who want to play this down. Oh, you're talking about something with a 99+% survival rate, which is not the case. I believe that the fatality rate is definitely higher than 1%, and probably by a few. And again, the more that we are humble about what we think we know, the better with this, because again, we don't really know squat. We're learning it in real time. Same thing with the experts, by the way. And everybody loves to play neener whenever experts change their opinions or their guidance. Other than saying early on, don't wear masks, which I said at the time was disastrous because I didn't believe it, and I knew exactly what they were doing. I knew that it was a lie that was intended to save masks for the medical community, but there had to be a better way, because public health authorities cannot lie in the middle of a pandemic, because their trust, the trust that we have to have in them has to remain unchallenged, and that was a self-own by a lot of people in the medical community. And then when a lot of them later on subsequently said, oh, well, if you're out protesting for a good cause, that's not dangerous. Again, that as well wasn't helpful. So this is one of these things where we have to be humble about what we think we know about this. The situation is evolving, but there does seem to be a consensus developing that come the beginning part of next year, one way or another, things should be a little bit better. And I wonder how that's going to guide how everybody goes through this. And then again, specifically the people in the bubble, because the thing of it is that the NBA, I mean, if they can't make it work under these circumstances, they're not going to make it work under any circumstances. So I'm actually at the point where my optimism is sort of rising that they are going to make it all the way through this thing here at this point. Even with some of the early things that have happened, I am getting the sense that once the games resume, that there might be enough positive momentum going on, people learning their lessons about how they have to maintain the protocols. I'm getting a little more optimistic about that. What do you think?
Well, Rick, overall, I've discussed this. I always said that we've seen how the media machinates at the end of the day, or whatever the specific word that I was looking for there, is that we've seen the media shift from death counts to case counts and just go across the board. And like I said, the job of the media is to inform the public on what is going on, but we also cannot go out there and say that the media is not saying certain things for their own, or, it's not, we always have to understand, like, it's very similar, I actually see analysis of documentary filmmaking. The assessment that we make as people who watch documentaries, that they always have to be 100% fact-based. And that's purely not the case for all documentaries. Someone's opinion on something and written down. And I think the issue we have to deal with media at times is that every media entity has to talk about coronavirus now. And by default, they are going to talk about the things that people will want to read about. And what we want to read about are rising case counts, death counts, fear, and how to protect ourselves. Those are the things that have always sold in terms of media in the United States and possibly around the world. And I think in the long run, we're starting to see fear dissipate a bit, because we've seen while case counts are rising, we've seen a dip in death recently. And I think the main concern for players in the bubble is that I think not necessarily that the game would not continue to move forward, but I think the league is more concerned if the sanctity of the playoffs was compromised by a team having to drop out, or a group of players, superstars or otherwise, being forced to drop out, essentially causing issue with the league. Sort of like, it's like the general baseline of how the league would normally work. If it feels needed, I think the league would probably find a way to stop it. But at this point, since we've seen the MLS sort of move through their own issues with their
as well in looking at this, and I think what I'm about to bring up is something that, oddly enough, makes me, again, a little bit more optimistic that they're going to be able to get through the season and that none of the players are going to blow this thing. And here's what I'm pointing to, is I wonder to what extent fear might come into play. We're hearing now, you're right about this, about the death counts have been lower, but they've been going up in Florida. ICU and hospital use in Florida is getting to be pretty bad. So the whole notion of, if you get this, you may end up in an overflowing hospital getting God knows what kind of treatment, just because, again, everything on the ground, I'm sure you're going to be getting from the health professionals will be as good as they can provide. But look at what happened in Italy. Look at what happened in New York. When you are one person caught up in the midst of all of that, and I promise you, no matter how rich and famous you are, you're getting treated like anybody else in an ICU ward under these circumstances. So as we keep hearing about the rising ICU and hospitalization counts in Orlando, I wonder to what extent that's going to work on the scared straight level, if you will.
I think minimal at best, Rick.
Really?
I think
okay.
He's already had a plan in place getting player with the ICU. But again, Rick, this is where I feel the media has done a disservice, at least for younger, healthy individuals. They don't tend to go to the ICU. It tends to be past. They tend to be asymptomatic, and they tend usually not to have any major true issues at this point. It really seems to be, at least judging from the case studies that I've read, and in terms of certain regions in Florida, it seems to be people who are generally old and with pre-existing conditions filling up these hospitals. So I would say that's a misnomer, but I would understand if a player is already afraid of the coronavirus. We saw the whole thing with Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert. It would not shock me if a scenario where a player could get it and give it to a star player where there could be some animosity or problems in the future for their team. You still don't know truly how the Donovan Mitchell Rudy Gobert situation is going to play out in Orlando right now. Because right now, they both in public and say everything's okay, but if the first couple games if the Jazz don't play well, that's going to get brought up at some point.
Yeah, there's the interpersonal part of that between teammates, but then
and
also...
I think that's going to be the biggest thing that the league's going to have to deal with if multiple positive cases arise.
Right. Well, and unless we're in a circumstance in the next month where there are hardly any NBA, NHL, or MLB games, if they all get scrapped, then throw what I'm about to say out the window. But we're about to learn a whole lot in the time ahead about what I've just been speculating about over a period of time. Lasting damage that occurs to those who have this, even in the milder cases. Are they still having issues subsequently? Is anything happening long term that could jeopardize lung capacity, which is very important in the NBA? So all these things where we're sitting here and we're wondering, or I am, but I don't hear a lot of other people, quite frankly, speculating on it. And I think it's an important question to be posed in terms of the threat that this could pose to people's careers. One way or another, you got to think by sometime, in mid-August, late August, we're going to have the answers on this, on what kind of risk players are at, even if they've had a milder case of this, quote-unquote.
Right, and at least for now, there hasn't been any full reporting yet in terms of athletes who have had coronavirus and the long-term lasting effects. And I mean, we're still just learning about it in terms of just regular communication from the medical level. And it's going to be very interesting to see just generally what could happen next. My issue is, and I think we're always going to say, that since it is the common narrative story of the moment, the nature of fear is how it works. That it takes the one thing, it takes control away from people. And when people who have perceptual control get taken away from things, to act irrationally. And because of that, we're going to see how it's going to be interesting to see how these teams come together and what teams are going to play well in the bubble and what teams will not play well in the bubble.
Exactly, and there is so much about this that makes everything unpredictable here, in the sense that even top teams could be more vulnerable to upsets. The NBA is not generally that way. You look at 4 years in a row of Cavs versus Warriors in the finals. The NBA tends to be a very top-heavy league. This could be somewhat of an equalizer, so we'll have to see how all of this plays out. And again, we started off, of course, by looking at the bubbles and the follies everything that's been going on since they got there. But inevitably, any conversation about the coronavirus, even if it's involving sports and some of the goofiness with athletes, it will take a darker turn, as we did here in this conversation. That is inevitable at this time. But, at the end of the day, here's hoping we can get through all of this with everybody in there staying safe and being able to pursue their careers to the best of their ability.
And Rick, I do personally believe, at least at this time, from what we know about the virus and the data that's out there right now, I personally believe that, again, I think everything tends to get overblown because we tend to see and consume as much media as we do in this timeline. But we also have to understand that until we know much more in a pure data empirical sense, it's worrying about a question mark. It's a big question mark at the end of the day. Because we don't know what's behind, or essentially if we want to use this chisel, let's make a deal. We don't know what's behind curtains. And until we truly know, it's fun to discuss and it's fun to posit scenarios, but until they actually happen, everyone's guess is as good as everyone else's guess at this point.
Yeah. And I think we all look forward to a point when we can get back at least closer to normal life in this country. A lot of people thought we were starting to get there in May and the early part of June. And right now, the spread of it is raging pretty much worse than it ever has at this point. So hopefully something can be done about that. Hopefully the NBA can stay safe and calm inside the bubble and give us all a boost that we could all use at this time here, a little bit of summer distraction. We shall see. I do know I will be staying on top of this with you, Ben Chu. And again, thank you so much for being a part of this great conversation.
Well, no problem, Rick. One point I also wanted to make earlier was that the league has also been discussing a scenario that if a vaccine was to come out in that rough timeline, that they could push the start of vaccine for next season. So it's going to be interesting because initially, they were very set on the December timeline. But now if they can get fans in arena by mid-April to May, we could see the season of 20. If I get it math properly, 2021, 22, it's going to be the whole calendar shift in the NBA is going to be very interesting to see if the bubble is successful. And if it isn't successful, it's going to be interesting to see what bubble 2.0 is probably going to look like.
That's right. First bubble 1.0's got to work, but yeah, no, that's an excellent point. The NBA needs to be pragmatic and nimble about that. And again, if we're looking at a vaccine in the early part of 2021, and I know Adam Silver's probably got Anthony Fauci and everybody else on speed dial, then yes, putting it off until you can come back closer to normal would be absolutely the way to go. First, they got to get through this circumstance here as we all continue to navigate a circumstance unlike any that we have ever seen, and the NBA is trying to come back in completely unprecedented circumstances. We will continue to follow that. Thank you again for your contribution here, Ben Chu, and we'll be doing a little bit of a preview of the resumption here subsequently on the show. In the meantime, thank you everybody for tuning in to FDH Lounge Mini Episode 1254.